mad people could become the kind of cultural, spiritual vanguard of a new great awakening, of a revolution.
You're listening to the Contemplative Light podcast with your host, Clint Sabom.
Hey, and welcome to the Contemplative Light podcast. I'm your host, Clint Sabom. Contemplative Light is a community of inner spiritual writers and teachers providing resources for the healing of persons. Contemplative Light, silence, practice, healing. And we've got a lot of good things going on in 2019. Mark Shaw has a book out, Dante's Road, and you can get that on our website at contemplativelight.com. You can also find it on Amazon. And we also have online classes available in spirituality and growth, and you can check those out as well on our website at contemplativelight.com. All right, Dr. Seth Farber, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. You have a book you wrote in 2012, I believe, Spiritual.
Yeah, that was the last one. Yeah.
So you want to tell our listeners maybe a little bit about what that's about?
Oh, yeah. I should say that that I always think of that book like writing a book on Ross Perot. Are you too young to have heard of Ross Perot?
Oh, no, I remember Ross Perot. I remember his run for presidency.
Yeah, because there was a time that everyone was excited about it. In fact, I knew this friend, well, not a friend, but someone I knew a little bit at the time. He was writing a book about Ross Perot after his first run. I'm sure it was never published because he was never heard of again after that. People thought it was going to be something, the start of something new. Unfortunately, I feel it's really happened to Mad Pride anyway. There's still a movement against psychiatry, but it doesn't have the same angle that the Mad Pride movement had. So
Mad Pride's kind of the idea that there's kind of spiritual gifts. The difference between a breakdown and a breakthrough is minuscule, and there's spiritual gifts that sometimes come with what's typically called mental illness, coming off of the tradition of Thomas Saz, who said a lot of people were deemed mentally ill not because they were wrong, but because the world itself was wrong, and adaptation to the world meant psychological health, and that wasn't really a good model to follow.
I think you're mixing, right, but you're getting Saz and Laing kind of mixed together.
Okay, yeah, I liked Laing better. I remember that. I never read Saz. I read Laing.
So, I mean, what you said sounds more like Laing, actually.
Okay, so R.D. Laing. Why don't you tell us a little bit about R.D. Laing?
Actually, I had a connection to both of them. Probably more to intellectually and spiritually more to Laing, but technically more to Tom, because he wrote the foreword to my first book, and Laing was dead at the time. So there was no question of him writing the foreword.
So Thomas Saz, the guy that wrote The Myth of Mental Illness, was someone you knew personally, huh? Yeah,
well, I had the good fortune to be introduced to Tom when I was writing a book against the mental death system, as I call it, because I met a person who's since dead named Ron Leifer. He'd be about probably 85 if he were still alive. And he was a psychiatrist that was affiliated with what at the time was called the Mental Patients Liberation Movement.
Okay.
And Ron had been a close friend of Thomas Saz and lost his job at State University of New York in Syracuse as a professor because he stood up for Tom's right to speak out against mental illness, which the university did not appreciate. Unfortunately for the university, when Tom wrote his controversial book, The Myth of Mental Illness, it was published in 1961, based on the idea that mental illness is a myth, as the book title says. He had tenure, so they couldn't fire him. They would have liked to have fired him. and they shut him up. They gave him a salary, but they told him to shut up. They wouldn't let him teach. So he was a controversial figure, and actually, I was a little surprised that they shut him up. I thought the universities in those days were less politically correct than they are today. So you would have thought that someone could say there's no such thing as mental illness and still speak publicly, but apparently it was too much of a threat to the university, their funding or whatever. But so,
well, he's in the textbooks now. I mean, he's mentioned in textbooks coming out still. Yeah.
Well, now that he's dead, I suppose even the psychiatric establishment might find him a more appealing.
Right. Now that he's dead, time to assimilate him. Time to capitalize.
Yeah. Like they do with, he'll never be an icon like Martin Luther King Jr., but I mean, that's a kind of classic example of a very subversive, dangerous person denounced by the New York Times itself, the bastion of liberalism in America, and now made into a, paper mache icon, blah, blah.
Kinda, yeah. Yeah. It's gotten pretty crazy.
It was announced by the Times when he came out against the war in Vietnam. Martin Luther King Jr., not Zaz. He never made it. So, Ron Liefeld, the psychiatrist
really
who lost his job.
Things. I remember that essay he had about there's some things I'd never want to adapt to. So he, it's kind of same spirit.
You mean Martin Luther King Jr. you're talking about?
Yeah. He there's a lot of things in society he didn't want to adapt to. I think he has some essay about adaptation as being something positive and mainstream psychology. And he was like, well, I don't want to adapt to many things in society.
Well, I have that quote from in my book that I heard about from David, made me aware of it. And a couple lines or something where he said, the world will be saved by the psychologically maladapted.
That's it.
He was not thinking of mad people at the time. He defined Abraham Lincoln and a whole bunch of Frederick Douglass and people like that as psychological. He was speaking of, deviant social dissidents and quote unquote deviants, intellectual deviants. But had there been a mad pride movement, he probably would have supported it of Martin Luther King had he been alive. But it didn't happen till later.
Yeah. So what do you say with someone that they're 20 to 23, and all of a sudden the cosmos opens up to them, and they feel some sort of Kundalini experience, and then about 6 months to a year later, they're just depressed and anxious and all disoriented inside, and they end up going to a psychiatrist. They get on a bunch of meds, and they're still like wanting validation for the Kundalini experience, but everybody else thinks they're a mess. Then what happens? What do you say at that point?
Yeah, when you started saying that, and right into my mind came the famous lines from Alan. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. Allen Ginsberg said that in Howl.
Oh, yeah, sure, yeah. The best minds of my generation, driven by madness or whatnot.
Yeah, I used to be able to recite the first few lines of it, but I haven't done it in a while. Hoffman claimed he had memorized Howl. I don't know if that's true. I heard him say that. Since you're younger than me, I'm not even sure if these were iconic names of iconic people, but I'm not sure if they're known to you or your audience now.
Oh yeah, they're still iconic, man.
Oh,
I mean, there's a whole wave of beatnik and hippies in my generation too, man.
Yeah,
it didn't die. No worries.
Okay, so when I say Abbie Hoffman said he memorized Allen Ginsberg, you know who I'm talking about then, yeah. So,
did you know Ginsberg too?
What?
Did you know Ginsberg?
He used to be around all the time. I called him up and asked him if I could put him on the board of the Network Against Coercive Psychiatry. I didn't know him.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't hang out with him. I didn't know him like I knew Zaz.
And what did he say?
Back in I'm like 67 now, so I kind of in the tail end of the 60s, but I was interested in that whole thing when I was like in 9th grade. So I was reading about it in the mid 60s, and by 68 I decided I was a revolutionary and all that kind of thing. The war in Vietnam. So Allen Ginsberg was around then. He was at every anti-war demonstration. So I used to see him around a lot. But
sure,
I didn't actually read Hall, at least not until after I got involved in the anti-psychiatry movement. It's just one of the great Mad Pride poems.
Absolutely, it's a battle cry.
Yeah. Although it's not the kind of vehement denunciation of psychiatry that happened later. It's more of how these people who are having mystical experiences are misunderstood by the psychiatric institution.
Sure.
And of course, Allen Ginsberg's mother was a victim of psychiatry. A victim of Allen, too, unwittingly.
I didn't know that.
He signed the paper allowing her to be lobotomized.
Oh, wow. And that was now the mental patients liberation movement. That was partly responsible for getting that kind of almost put on the way back burner as a treatment. Not lobotomy, but the ECT, right? Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you could. It was too small. I don't know if they could claim responsibility for that at that time.
Okay.
But they tried to. Let's see. The MAD at the time it was called Mental Patients Liberation. Started. I wasn't even aware of it then. It was so small, and even though I was an anti-war protester in 1970, I didn't know there was a Mental Patients Liberation movement. So there was a small movement in the 70s, and it grew in the 80s when I found it. But I think if anyone could claim credit for getting rid of ECT, which it subsequently came back, I'm not sure if it came back in the same way, but they're doing it. But Ken Kesey could probably claim credit for it. Not the movie.
The movie version of his book.
Yeah,
with
really
Jack Nicholson.
Yeah. I'm told that it really did a lot to discredit electroshock and bring an end to it. So I met Zaz. Zaz wrote a number of books, The Myth of Mental Illness, and he wrote Manufacture of Madness. And he said that, what was it? That people had problems of life that the mental health establishment called mental illness. So that was, I'm not going to do justice to Tom's theory, because he wouldn't approve it because he was a libertarian, in the Libertarian Party.
Yeah, and you're not. You're left of neoliberal, or you don't like the term neoliberal. You're left.
No, I don't like it. It's just you're using the term neoliberal in a way that sounds. I think you're using it in its literal sense, but it has a different meaning. You're losing the term neoliberal to mean a new kind of liberal, the way I understood you to use it. But the term neoliberal,
the way you would use it.
I'm just using the way it's. I think it's technically correct to use it. It actually doesn't refer to anything that anyone would really consider liberal, except maybe Thomas Friedman. It's more of a libertarian or a fundamentalist faith in the implies a belief in the so-called free market.
Mm-hmm.
And that when people use the term liberal, generally they mean, at least my generation, and I think your generation, they mean someone like FDR. Is that what you meant? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you were using it correctly. But
I don't know. I was kind of asking you. I mean, I'd never heard of Caitlin Johnston before you sent me those links of hers. So
yeah,
I'm kind of trying to learn. I'm not, I've never really been overtly political, at least on this podcast.
Well, the term
except
neo,
with single issues.
So the term neo means new. So I thought you meant a kind of a new version of the newest version of liberal, neo.
Well, I kind of meant like the kind of establishment liberals, the Hillary Clintons, the kind of yuppie liberals, that kind of stuff, the bourgeois liberals.
Yeah. Okay. So the neoliberal specifically, I believe, refers to the idea that the government should keep its hands off corporations, and that the corporations should have the power to make, to have international trade unconstrained by government power.
Right. Okay.
Which is the opposite of what liberal meant for many people, which liberal for at least my generation, I think many people today, it means that the government does intervene, and the government is a buffer between the corporations and the population, because you can't trust the corporations to to watch out for the interests of the general public. So you need regulation, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
I think that's what most people mean by liberal today, and for at least most of the 20th century. So what these people who wanted to give corporations freer rein did, they attached the term liberal to very policies that were usually considered non-liberal, based on just giving the market unregulation of the free market. Milton Friedman.
Milton Friedman, yeah.
So at any rate, back to neoliberal. So I think you mean the newest version of liberal. Well, we used to call them left liberal, blah, blah, blah. People who had well, I won't go into that. We're getting away from, I don't know how it relates to psychiatry today, except...
yeah, I don't know either.
I guess neoliberal in the sense of no constraints on the corporations relates to psychiatry, because you look at the FDA and it's filled with people with all kinds of... It's supposed to be regulating the drugs. It doesn't do that anymore. It's, you have the revolving door between working in government and working in business, and working in psychiatry and working for the pharmaceutical industry. You have this everywhere. And really, this is the hallmark of neoliberalism today. So there's no constraints on what the pharmaceutical industry can do. And actually, there's a quote that I had from my book here, which is not the mad pride aspect, but it's something you had asked about. I told you that Clint, that things began to change in the late 70s. Was really things started getting better after One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Thomas Szasz. There was a lot of good legislation protecting people as a result of Tom's idea that people who are labeled mentally ill are not mentally ill, and to call them mentally ill is to come up with a pretext for taking away their constitutional rights. So there was a lot of positive legislation that gave people the right to have control over their own bodies and not be locked up in mental hospitals at the whim of a psychiatrist. And then there was the 60s counterculture. So in the 70s, you had a mental patients liberation movement. You had all kinds of different types of psychotherapy. And as Peter Bregan put it in his book, Toxic Psychiatry, psychiatry was in a lot of trouble. People started going to psychologists and social workers, people who didn't have MDs. Previously, psychiatrist was looked at as the expert. If you had a problem, you went to the expert, kind of like it is today. But in the 60s and 70s, people wanted to go to therapists. They went to Gestalt therapists, and so they were losing money. They were not doing well in the competition with non-medical therapists. So that's when they got together and they said, well, we got to do something about this. And they came up with the idea that they should change their bylaws of the American Psychiatric Association so they can accept money from the drug companies. And Peter Breggin, in a couple lines of it from his book, Toxic Psychiatry, actually, I quote these lines. I've quoted them a lot because they're kind of an eloquent, pithy way of describing the situation. First, he talked. There was a task force to study the impact of the potential loss of pharmaceutical support. That's what it was called, and they concluded that presciently, they concluded that the loss of support of the drug companies would be catastrophic. Thus, a decision was made to continue to collaborate. Breggin wrote, okay, they changed their laws. Breggin writes, the floodgates, in a book that was written in 1990 about a decision taken in 78, but the full consequences didn't start to be felt until the 90s. Now there are 10 times as many people on drugs as there were in 1970. Floodgates of drug company influence were open and would grow wider each year. This was only the beginning. The APA Board of Directors decided to throw ethical caution to the wind in 1980 and solicit drug companies' support for the major professional and cultural activities. And then here Breggin says, whatever function the American Psychiatric Association had ever fulfilled as a professional organization was now superseded by its function as a political advocate for the advancement of psych and pharmaceutical interests. Did you hear that last part?
Yeah, I did. That's a mic drop on the whole industry.
Yeah. So Thomas Oz wrote the foreword to my book, Madness, Heresy, and the Rumor of Angels. Ironically, the book was more influenced by Laing, probably, who Oz hated. But Laing,
really?
Yeah, they hated each other.
I didn't know that. That's crazy.
Yeah, should I tell you an amusing anecdote about Tom's hatred for Laing?
Sure.
It's a little off the topic of mad pride, but
it's kind of interesting, though. Personal anecdotes.
Laing was. I was at this conference, but I wasn't at this particular. There were like 5,000 people at this conference. It's called The Evolution of Psychotherapy. And they had every innovative therapist in the country there, 1985. So Laing and Zaz were there, and Laing gave us one speech that, each person was supposed to pick who would give a commentary on the speech. Laing, I guess naively picked Thomas Zaz. He should have known because that Zaz wouldn't like it, because Zaz was kind of an atheist and a kind of no nonsense kind of rationalist, libertarian, and Laing was a hippie in the opposite, really. The only thing they agreed on was that so-called problems in life were not mental illnesses. So anyway, Laing gave his, kind of mystical speech, and Zaz was supposed to comment, and he said, for the first time, got up and said, for the first time, I know what it's like to be forcefully locked in a mental hospital. Said, I feel like I'm forcefully involuntarily locked in a loony bin for the last hour. Listening to speech.
That's messed up.
and Laing, Ronnie Laing, was kind of shocked when after Zaz made those remarks, after the whole thing ended and people were milling about, Tom went up to him and offered him his hand to shake.
Really?
Yeah.
And did Laing shake it?
I can't remember whether he might have done it. I suppose it probably depended on whether Laing himself was drunk or sober.
was was Laing a drinker?
Yeah,
A smoker of weed?
he would give lectures when he was drunk sometimes. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, let's go into some Laing. I mean, I think some of our listeners could benefit from hearing about some of Laing's ideas.
Yeah.
About all this.
Well, my favorite book was the Politics of Experience by Laing. That was probably his most controversial and probably is the one that made him famous, actually, on college campuses. It's the one that scholars, even the scholars that say they'll grant that Laing was not a total flake and had some intelligent things to say, will always say, well, that book is over the line, blah, blah, blah. That's because it's such a trenchant social critique. Now, I'll quote you, I'll read you some quotes from the book, because it's actually so powerful. I can still read these quotes. Like, to me, it's kind of the same kind of effect on me, the same kind of nostalgic effect on me, and the lines have the same kind of forcefulness that I kind of have when I hear, Bob Dylan songs from the 70s or 60s or 70s.
Sure.
If the human race survives, future men will look back on our enlightened epoch as a veritable epic age of darkness. The laughs on us, they will see that what we call schizophrenia was one of the forms in which often through quite ordinary people, the light began to break in the cracks in our all too closed minds. I'll read you a few more quotes and then I can explain if there's any question.
Sure.
We respect the voice, and of course, when he wrote this, he knew it was going to be provocative. We respect the voyager, the explorer, the climber, the spaceman. Why is it we do not respect the mad? We're often exploring the inner space and time of consciousness. We should learn to accord to so-called schizophrenics who have come back to us from their voyage into inner space no less respect than the often no less lost explorers of the Renaissance.
Amen.
I just want to tell your listeners that this was said, just a few years after John Kennedy, who was another victim of the establishment, but politically, he didn't know R.D. Laing or anything like that. So he had denounced a war on mental illness, but so at the time was actually progressive, but nobody knew anything but mental illness in the end. And here Laing was saying that these people that in the 60s, this was new, completely new, that these people, their relatives and the psychiatric establishment looked at as the saddest, sickest, most pathetic, pitiful people on earth, that they were like explorers from the Renaissance. So,
well, that's what comes to mind for me on that is the second part of the Joseph Campbell monomyth, the kind of descent into the underworld.
Yeah. I'm sure, because Laing wrote this before Campbell wrote, what's that book? The
Hero
Journey or
with
something.
1,000 pages.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
But I guess that archetype was pretty well known, the death rebirth thing. I don't think Campbell got it from Laing, but he was. Well, actually, it was Campbell that made that. Here, there's a quote from Campbell. So Campbell was somewhat familiar with Laing because it was in the 70s that Joseph Campbell said the schizophrenic and the mystic are swimming in the same, infinite ocean of bliss. But
sure.
But the schizophrenic is drowning and the mystic is swimming.
There you go. That's perfect. That's pitch perfect, I think.
Yeah. So my idea, I think it was my idea. Well, I'm the first to use that metaphor. I might even have said it somewhere, was that instead of just saying, well, putting the mental patient, what's Laing's idea too, instead of putting the mental patient in a mental hospital and torturing him, why not teach him to swim like the mystic?
That's right. That's right.
So that was
you got to
really,
get stronger muscles to swim in the sea of consciousness. It's like building up spiritual muscles, psychic muscles.
Yeah.
You know, let me ask you something, because at the time Laing was using the term schizophrenic, I mean, they didn't have the variations of diagnoses that they do today. I almost wonder if he was using schizophrenic in almost a generalized thing that could probably apply to tons of diagnoses today, almost like a just kind of umbrella term.
Well, the term is still, even today, it's completely arbitrary. There's no reliability to these diagnoses. It's ridiculous. In the 70s, when I was in graduate school, I had to take a class called Introduction to Testing, and the class was taught by a statistician. So we spent the whole, semester learning that psychological testing had no reliability, no validity. You could not make predictions. Operationally, it was useless. You could not make predictions on the basis of it. It told you nothing useful. The test
doesn't it give you a general? I mean, ideally, though, just to play devil's advocate, doesn't it give you a general map of the ways in which someone is out of formation, so to speak?
No, not psychiatric. I mean, pretty much all that psychiatric diagnosis tell you, particularly when you're dealing with someone labeled schizophrenic, is that the person is probably hearing voices or, somehow. Often people usually people who are labeled schizophrenic are either having so-called hallucinations, they're hearing voices, or they're having mystical experiences that are frightening to them.
Sure. Or a combination of the two.
Yeah, but they're usually, most of the so-called schizophrenics I met had some, what I would consider some kind of mystical experience. But anyway, that whole group of people that was considered psychotic, sometimes they're labeled schizophrenic, sometimes they're labeled bipolar, sometimes schizoaffective, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So even back then, it was used toward that group of people. And back then there was a big difference between bipolar. There still is today. Schizophrenic's the worst thing you can be called. As I said, it's like being an untouchable in India, schizophrenic. So bipolar's a little bit better. It's a lot better, but kind of means you're fucked up and you need the drugs, but you have some dignity to you, blah, blah, blah.
It's also kind of a garbage can diagnosis, I think. So the drug companies, the insurance pay, I think.
What, both of them? Yeah, you mean both?
Yeah, both of them. Yeah.
But as I said, science is supposed to, it's supposed to have reliability. It's not supposed to be. They claim they're scientific. That if you're interviewed or given tests by one psychiatrist, they say one thing, and another psychiatrist they say another thing. But that's basically what it's all about. In fact, I hate to get. How much more time do we have? Because
we have all the time you want to have.
Oh, because I didn't want to get to the end without mentioning going back to the mad pride thing. But
sure, we'll get back there.
So yeah, I was going to say the Rosenhan Experiments show, which you probably haven't heard of. I mean, some of the most important things in psychiatry are unknown to the general public. The Rosenhan experiment showed not only do they not know the difference between a so-called schizophrenic and a so-called bipolar, or what was then called manic depressive, they don't even know the difference between a schizophrenic and a sane person. They can't even tell the sane from the insane. They can't even tell the difference between someone who's had a breakdown and is going through a crisis as a result of that death rebirth experience, as you mentioned and Joseph Campbell mentioned, and someone who's completely normal. Because Rosenhan, a psychologist, 1972 or 3, the article was published in 73 in the prestigious journal Science. He got probably wouldn't be published in Science today, but this was 73, and everybody was a bit loose from the 60s, counterculture. So Rosenhan got 10 of his friends together, all of whom were professionals, none of whom had psychiatric histories, and they pretended they were crazy to get into a mental hospital, to get into several different mental hospitals. And once they were in there, they acted completely normal. But none of this, they couldn't convince the psychiatrists they were normal. It took Rosenhan himself 3 months to get out of there, to get out of the loony bin. And he said,
I think I might have read about that.
Yeah. If you took a course, I suppose, I don't know, you might have read it online nowadays.
No, I think I did read it in a course, and I think in the same one, I might have also read something about some women doing it similar in the late 1800s to get some reform in some insane asylums.
Really? I didn't heard of it.
Yeah.
What course was this?
I don't know. It was some research class. I think I actually picked a similar topic as far as
I was going to say
mental history of mental health in America. Maybe was kind of my general topic.
My thought is it was probably taught by a sociologist or something rather than a psychologist.
Well, I mean, I really don't want to talk about it on air, but you just nailed it. I'll leave it at that. Like you just, it actually was like, I don't know. I mean, you had a moment of like psychic power there. Yeah. Like, I don't know how you got that, but yes, you got it.
Yeah. Because psychologists stay away from that kind
of. You got it.
Yeah. Just like, Irving Goffman, who wrote a brilliant critique of psychiatry, was an anthropologist and wrote his critique. Of course, in those days, you still had psychologists in the 60s and 70s. Now they're pretty rare. So they couldn't tell that he was normal and that his friends were normal. And when they wrote up there, they did the interview, even though they acted normal once they had gotten past the emergency room personnel by saying they were hearing strange sounds, they acted completely normal. And ironically, the only people who suspected that they weren't mentally ill was the other patients.
Sure. The other patients probably could tell pretty quickly.
Many of the patients, you're not mentally ill.
Right.
The doctor said, well, this is a classic case of the doctor said this classic case of schizophrenia, and they wrote it.
That's funny. That's good. Yeah. I mean, I mean, it goes on and on and on and on. I mean, I'm sure there's stories all across America right now, probably people sitting.
Yeah, it's tragic.
Huddled in rooms, just feeling like nobody ever really understood, and they were missing.
Yeah, I should tragic. I mean, I'm laughing at the absurdity of it, but it's a tragic situation today.
Yeah, it's an ongoing thing.
I mean, it was tragic when I got involved because there were all these. I saw in the 70s, the late 70s, when I went to grad school. I started going to visiting people in mental hospitals. It wasn't until the mid 80s, or mid to late 80s. And so, but, I'd see people whose whole lives were ruined. And you have that today too. But then you would see people who still were recovering from or still had the effects of lobotomy or, 100 electroshocs or something. Older women. I remember an older woman came to see me and she had a terrible, she's probably about I say older, but back then I was 40. She's probably in her late 60s when she came to see me. But she seemed older because she had tardive dyskinesia. She'd been on it for years.
Yeah.
And she came to me. I guess someone told her that I was, this was in the 80s, that I was, a heretic within the field. But she didn't trust me at first, but she said she wanted to meet a husband. It's hard enough for men or women, particularly women, I guess, at that age, to meet a husband. And yet she had tardive dyskinesia. So I told her.
Right.
Yeah. And Anne was crazy.
Yeah, the odds were against her for sure.
But, a sad victim of it. But, after a couple months, she started acting sane with me. It's really amazing. I started, I treated her like she was normal. I helped her write an ad. And, at first, she'd just come in and yell at me like she was totally nuts. Not scream, but, just you idiot and call me names and stuff. But after a few months, she just suddenly started acting friendly to me.
Yeah. She had to get it out. She had to get out all the venting that had kind of accumulated.
I also,
and once she got that out, she was cool.
And I probably was the first professional that treated her, maybe the first person who treated her like she was normal.
Yeah, yeah. So how'd the course of therapy pan out?
Well, there's not too much I could have done for her. I mean, there's no way after being on those drugs for so many years she was going to get rid of the tardive dyskinesia. For a while, she called me up once a week, and I just lost touch with her.
What was it that caused the tardive dyskinesia? Haldol and ECT mainly, or what?
The drugs, not the.
Yeah. Which drugs?
Well, the drugs still cause. I should tell your audience, it's a lie if they tell you that the second generation of phenothiazines, the second generation of neuroleptics, I guess they're not
Antipsychotics.
Antipsychotics, yeah, do not cause tardive dyskinesia. They do cause tardive dyskinesia.
Oh yeah, I think there's class action lawsuits now for it.
So they came up with this idea in 1989 that we have a new drug, new class of drugs that doesn't cause tardive dyskinesia. So, yeah, it was the antipsychotic, all of the antipsychotics. Haldol, at the time, it was Haldol, Mellaril, Prolixin. Now it's Zyprexa, Risperdal, Seroquel, and there are a bunch of new ones that I don't even know the names of. That are the same kind of drug that cause tardive dyskinesia, which means for your audience that people develop spasms and in their limbs, sometimes in their mouth, their lips, and they can't control it. Spasms and tics, and it's very unseemly too. So it's embarrassing for people. Fortunately, when younger people came to me, I would advise them to get off the drugs. They didn't always do that, but when they did, usually they got better, and that's something that Robert Whitaker has documented in his books and in his articles on Bad in America, that people actually do much better when they get off contrary to what the psychiatrists tell you. Oh, your illness is going to come back if you get off the medication. Your illness is more likely, quote unquote, illness to go away if you get off the drugs. But you have to get off them gradually and slowly, because they're addictive and they produce withdrawal effects.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, your body gets probably habituated.
So back to R.D. Laing. So anyway, yeah. So the idea back in in those days and now they don't know. The psychologists don't know the difference between mad and the unmad, and they certainly don't know the difference. They don't acknowledge that there's a difference between a mystic and a schizophrenic.
Oh, I think some do. There's mystic psychologists out there in private practice.
In private practice, yeah. You can't last in a clinic. That's why I couldn't get a job. Once I took a position slightly critical, I mean, now I'm being very critical, but I went for job interviews. All I said was I don't believe in putting children on long-term psychiatric drugs, and that was it. I was no longer employable in the public mental health system.
Wow. I hear a lot of people saying that. I guess I didn't know that was a deal breaker, but yeah. I guess they really like feeding them kids them drugs.
Yeah, now. Well, they like it because they're making lots of money from it.
Yeah,
not only the drug companies, the psychiatrists. Well, they do get kickbacks in the they don't call them kickbacks, but they get money from the drug companies themselves. They'll do tests or they'll co-sign nowadays, if you if there's a study done of this, say a study on how a new drug performs compared to an old drug. Now the company has an interest in getting new drugs approved because that's more money, right? Yeah. I mean, so they want to say we got something better than Zyprexa. So what they do is they get the studies done by the drug company themselves, and then the drug company writes up ghost writes an article, and then they give it to a psychiatrist to sign it.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not a real test. It's just part of the promotion of the drug companies. But people think, well, this is a scientific thing, blah, blah, blah. Science is looking out for me.
Yeah, it's amazing how people aren't catching all these biased studies that are basically paid for. Yeah, it's amazing how so many people would just never occur to that and just kind of blindly trust the authority of science or something.
Yeah.
And it's not about the authority of science. It's about who's paying, who's got the motive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or the Pied Piper, yeah.
Absolutely.
So, anyway, back when I wrote this book, Madness, Heresy, and the Rumor of Angels, I already had the idea, Langian idea, that so-called schizophrenics were having mystical experiences. And that's, in fact, to go back to something you said, people are often in their early 20s or they're going off to college. Many of the people I interviewed for my first book were like that, particularly one woman I interviewed. I always wondered what happened to her because she was one of the smartest people I interviewed. It was with the most eloquent interview. And I wanted to, kind of follow up 10 years later, 20 years later, 30. But her name is Ellen Smith. So unless she's into this, I'm not going to find Ellen Smith on Facebook. So unless she's listening to this
this podcast, right. Connect at contemplativelight.com. Yeah, we'll put you back in touch with Dr. Farber after all these years.
Yeah, be good to be able to say that she's still stayed away from the psychiatric mind police for 30 years. I told her she was a schizophrenic who would never be normal, blah, blah, blah. So I interviewed her like 5 or 6 or 7 years after she'd been out and off the drugs for 7 years. And she was one of the best people to interview because she was so eloquent. She's the type of person that probably has written a couple novels or something like that. She was very gifted. And she had a number of mystical experiences when she was in college in Vermont, in the country.
Bennington?
It was, I don't know if it's still around, Goddard,
yeah. Close. I was close. Yeah. Liberal arts school. And yeah, I think that's still around.
Yeah. I forget what it was, Plainville or something like that. So Yeah, I quoted her in the book. Well, I interviewed her, and then I can't remember all the mystical experience she had, but she described them very well. So anybody with any kind of mystical or even a literary sensibility talking to this woman would have said, well, she's going through a crisis and she's a spiritual person. But, the psychiatric establishment don't have a literary sensibility, let alone a mystical sensibility. So
That's right.
yeah, she's chronically mentally ill. So here's another quote from R.D. Laing. Go back to this mad pride idea. Because there are two sides of the mad pride idea. One side is that the schizophrenic is a mystic. The other side is that the normal person is insane. What was the name of that movie? King of Hearts. Did you ever see that?
I might have. Remind me what that was about? Was that about a war?
I saw it in college. I think it was about maybe 50 years after the movie was made. If now it would be 50 years. It was made in the mid 60s, early 60s, with Alan Bates, who was an English French actor. I don't know, we've seen a lot of French movies. And it took place during a war, and King of Hearts. And they somehow, there's a loony bin in one of the European fronts of the war. Like, I guess it was in France. It was a French movie. And the people out of the loony bin, they all escape. This is during the war, and they're able to escape from the loony bin. And they set up their own society, blah, blah, blah. And they run it perfectly well. They're completely crazy in the movie, but they're functioning. They're getting along well. It's very I haven't seen it in 20, 30 years. And they're all very charming and attractive and interesting people. And right next to them, there are these people killing each other and shooting guns and so on and so forth. So it's kind of
right. Who's the crazy one?
Yeah.
Right.
Laing in movie. So here Laing says in Politics of Experience, the perfectly adjusted bomber pilot may be a greater threat to species survival than the hospitalized schizophrenic, deluded that the bomb is inside him. I should say that for the your younger audience, deluded that the bomb is inside him. There were a lot of so-called schizophrenics saying that then, because there was all this nuclear bomb testing in the 60s.
Yeah, they were feeling it, probably.
And,
like what's without is within, and what's within is without.
The bomb was, we were scared of the bomb because they'd have these drills where you had to get under your desk, which was a ridiculous thing. The idea being that if the other side, the Russians, dropped the bomb, we'd be safer under the desk.
No, that does not make any sense, right? Like, get down. Like, what's that going to do? Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe.
Hide under the covers or something, right? Like, what the hell?
Yeah. Maybe it was the military's way of trying to acclimatize us to living with the bomb or something. Anyway.
Yeah. Who knows what their thinking was? It's like the false sense of safety. Like, let's do these drills so they feel safe. They feel like we've got a protection plan in place.
Yeah,
right?
There were people who spend a lot of money to buy these bomb shelters.
Yeah, that's true. That's a whole market, right?
Well, there was then, yeah.
I think there's still a kind of underground conspiracy market for stuff like that.
Yeah. So Laing said the perfectly adjusted bomber pilot, they said this in 1967 in Politics, perfectly adjusted bomber pilot may be a greater threat to species survival than the hospitalized schizophrenic, deluded that the bomb is inside him. Okay, so here he's saying that the person that we consider a hero, the bomber pilot, is really a greater threat to society than the person we consider pathetically, pitiful, mentally ill, blah, 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 a danger, which is a, very radical thing to say at the time.
But it makes perfect sense. I mean, who do you think is going to destroy the world?
Yeah.
Like, well-behaved people following orders and getting in line, or crazy people that know that,
Yeah.
the whole universe is inside of them, so there's no point in like doing a whole lot
Yeah.
crazy on the outside, or something, I mean, it makes perfect sense. I mean, you don't even have to go that far. You could just look at a schizophrenic and look at the bomber pilot and be like, well, that guy's going to do some damage. This one's not going anywhere,
That was said in like 67, before there was any kind of anti-war movement. It must have been, I mean, well, there was a little, but I mean, I think the first big anti-war protests were in 68 and 69 against the war in Vietnam. And, then you had hundreds of thousands of people. But this was, I'm sure there were anti-war movements eras, but this was the first time you had an anti-war movement since since the end of the war. So people were not familiar with the idea of being anti-war. So anyway, and then Laing goes on to make another statement that really is his most one that's most consistent with the whole mad pride idea, which was the one that I picked up on when I wrote the book and got enthusiastic about mad pride. Our society may itself have become biologically dysfunctional, and some forms of schizophrenic alienation from the alienation of our society, meaning normal society being alienated from, the natural rhythms of the world, of nature, from the rhythms of nature. Some forms of schizophrenic alienation from the alienation of our society may have a sociobiological function that we have not yet recognized.
Huh. That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, why wouldn't it? If it's being produced by evolution, why wouldn't it have a function within the larger schema?
Now, I think that was the place where he said that most clearly. He's the first person to say that. In fact, it didn't really become that popular an idea, but I wrote about it and I wanted to popularize it, that the idea that the mystic and the schizophrenic, or many mystics, some are just escapists, but, that's why I use the example of kind of mystics who became abolitionists and all. Theodore Weld, I talked about in the book on Mad Pride. He was a Christian who became a strong activist in the 1840s and 50s. He went all around the country preaching against slavery. Christianity was still a progressive, to use an anachronistic term. They didn't use the term progressive in the 1840s, but if we looked at it, it was what we would consider progressive today. It didn't become a right-wing phenomenon until the late 19th century. So, that's why people like Ralph Waldo Emerson started off as a Christian.
Yeah, I mean, then
and the abolitionists were almost all Christians.
What, like a little more Eastern, I guess, in some of his ideas.
What?
Emerson.
Well, he wrote a famous thing when he was still a Unitarian minister that got him thrown out of the church, or almost did. I think he resigned. It created so much controversy, called the Divinity School lecture.
Okay, yeah, I think I came across that years ago.
It reads like a liberal Christian would say today, but with so much more eloquence and passion and fervor.
Okay. Well, I wanted to mention something to you. This is kind of interesting anecdote. I had some friends I went with to a half-price bookstore here about a week ago or 2 weeks ago.
Is that
found your...
Yeah, go on.
Well, we found your book, and one of my friends, she was like, she found your book.
Which one?
She was like, hey, the Spiritual Gift of Madness.
Yeah.
And they had 3 copies there. And she found the book, and I mean, these are kind of hippie girls, and she found the book, and she was like, "Hey, Clint, you'd really like this."
Yeah.
And I looked at it, and then now we're here talking on the podcast. But I was telling her that you were messaging me about how the Mad Pride movement never took off, and she was like, "Well, it needs a parade. It needs a parade to really take off. That's what it needs."
Yeah. Yeah.
I just thought I'd throw that in, the missing piece.
Yeah. We'd have to get some celebrities to get the parade. I mean,
I'm sure plenty qualify. Some of those actors, I tell you, man, you could get them.
Yeah. I don't know if they've come out publicly. It's not,
well,
it hasn't become fashionable like being gay has, or at least in New York, not in Texas.
Right. It's like it's still a little. It's more accepted, not quite as stigmatized, but yeah, it's certainly not cool.
Yeah. Well, it's the home of George Bush, I guess. Although,
the home of George Bush here in Texas.
Yeah. Well, I guess he was born in Connecticut, but he's really a Texan.
Yeah. They're from Texas.
Evil
they got
family.
a ranch here, and then they're in Houston too. Yeah. But that was kind of well, I mean, I was trying to tie Bush in. I couldn't really do it.
So that was the that's a used bookstore in Texas. Where my book.
Yeah. This was like a half price bookstore in San Antonio, somewhere near downtown.
Mostly secondhand books, then.
Yeah, I think some of them were secondhand. Yours looked new, and they had 3 copies. I mean, if you're worried about distribution, someone somewhere is doing a good job if it got there.
Yeah.
But yeah, they had actually a huge selection, like a better selection than even like a Barnes and Noble would have, for example.
Oh, yeah.
They had a really in all the kind of different eclectic subjects, and yeah, it was pretty interesting. It felt kind of synchronicitous.
Yeah.
That I came across your book.
Yeah, right after we were started talking, right?
No, right before we started talking, I contacted you because I found the book, and I was like, oh gosh, I got to get this guy on the podcast.
Was this before we were on the same? You were on my Facebook, or I was on your?
Exactly. Right. Exactly. I found the book before I got on your Facebook, and then I was like, oh, maybe I'll just approach him the Facebook way.
Oh yeah, I have so many people, I don't know who's there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it certainly works with a lot of the stuff we do, because I mean, we're kind of looking at unconventional ways around spirituality and self-help.
So this was the basic theme of
like I shared with you, written some pieces about madness and mysticism and the kind of intersection of all this stuff.
Yeah. Oh, it was a beautifully written piece. Yeah.
Hey.
So, I mean, there still is an anti-psychiatry movement. It doesn't have the Mad Pride theme. It doesn't have the mystical theme, which was what got me excited about Sasha's. Maybe I should tell that story, this Mad Pride story. Now that I've talked so long, I haven't gotten more into it. I think it illustrates it pretty well.
Go for it.
Let me just underline this again. Our society may have become biologically dysfunctional, and some forms of schizophrenic alienation from the alienation of society may have a sociobiological function that we have not yet recognized. That's the point. I really, even though it's dead and gone, at least for the time being, the Mad Pride movement, Sasha, as I said, Sasha DeBrawl started, he and Jack McNamara started Icarus Project. They started when they were young, and as they got older, they became more conservative. So
yeah, I think Wilbur refers a good bit to the Icarus Project.
Who?
Ken Wilber?
Oh, now Wilbur. Oh, Wilbur. Yeah. Now
Well, I don't want to get us off track.
Yeah.
Why don't we just stick to Mad Pride? What went wrong with Mad Pride and
Well, Wilbur was
in
a
the Icarus
critique
project?
of R.D. Laing, a critic of R.D. Laing. Then maybe he's changed.
Was Wilbur a critic of R.D.
Yeah.
Laing? I mean, because Wilbur does talk about spiritual emergencies and things being out of formation.
Well, maybe he's gotten more hip in the last 10 or 20 years, but in the 1980s, he was critical of Laing, very critical of Laing, and critical of Groff, too, who you mentioned before. He was pro-psychiatry for so-called schizophrenics. Maybe he's changed.
Well, I don't know if I've read anything about pro or against psychiatry, but he's kind of just talked about like where they may get placed on the integral map and where they may be out of formation, and where they may be unintegrated and stuff.
Yeah.
That's all the stuff I've read on him, but I mean, I haven't gone through his whole canon by any means.
He misunderstood Sri Aurobindo too.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, a critic of Ken Wilber. Welcome.
Oh, you're not a fan of his. That's good.
No, I am a fan, but I always find like critics of them like that have interesting things to say. Like critics are always, because I mean, to be a critic of them, you've got to kind of be able to grasp them and even have like a kind of very advanced kind of commentary on stuff to kind of say where Wilbur might have gone wrong.
Well, I haven't read that much of him, but I've read enough to know that he interprets Sri Aurobindo in the light of his own immersion in a how do you put it? I would call it a much more escapist kind of eschatology. So, that's a whole other story. I'm a more traditional Eastern view than Aurobindo's view.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, his guru was Free John, or whatever he called himself at the end. I don't know if you knew that.
Who?
Wilbur's guru was a guy who had a million different names in the 60s and 70s. He died about 10 years ago. And
the Buddhist guy?
His name?
Was he a Buddhist?
No, he's a Hindu. Free.
Oh, okay.
Free John was one of his names. I don't think.
Oh, okay.
Many of his books were written under the name of Free John. His name to something Free John. I don't know. You don't know. But okay, so back. So yeah, so the idea that schizophrenia could be almost like a kind of biological, so-called schizophrenia, a biological adaptation to a society that has a sick society, for want of a better term, an insane society, as Erich Fromm called it. And the book was actually called The Sane Society, but it should have been called The Insane Society, Erich Fromm's book, because he pretty much tried to demonstrate that we lived in an insane society. At any rate, like Laing said, normal people have killed 100 million of their fellow normal human beings in the last 50 years. The condition of alienation, of being asleep, of being unconscious, of being out of one's mind is the condition of the normal man. Society highly values its normal man. It educates children to lose themselves and to become absurd, and thus to be normal. Okay, so here, I'm going to read this other illustration of Mad Pride. I was reading Sasha, who I just described. I should say he's
the Icarus Project, man.
He's still an activist, somewhat critical of the mental health system. He just dropped his more. He came to view the ideas as crazy, as far-fetched, as I forgot what he called it. He told me that I don't know. He read one about the article you just read, and he described it as. He described it as mano, the ego-fueled something. the
Oh, he wasn't a big fan.
No, he became very, very, at least at that time, much more conservative.
Mm-hmm.
Politically, he still wanted to see kind of reforms within the mental health system, but the idea of a world of the kind of utopian ideas, messianic ideas, he reacted against that completely. Although 5 years earlier, he had been expressing those ideas.
Speaking of utopia visions, do you think John Lennon's song "Imagine" captures that well?
Oh, well, it captures the zeitgeist, the utopian zeitgeist of the 60s. It was pretty popular. I think it was written in the 60s, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Hello?
You kind of broke up there for a second.
Hello?
Did you do something? Hello? You broke up a bit. You can hear me? Can you hear me?